Thank you for listening to Serves You Right. Today we're talking to Kelli White, the author of Napa Valley Then and Now and her new book, Wine Confident. I know Kelli from GuildSomm and have read her work for years. Super excited to talk to her today. Without any further ado, let's talk to one of the foremost experts on wine in the U.S. Thanks for listening. Well, Kelli, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I've got you author of Napa Valley Then and Now, a book that could be used as a doorstop, one of the larger books out there, and then now Wine Confident. And of course, known throughout the wine world. I actually first got introduced to you through GuildSomm, which I'm sure a lot of people know you through, and you've worked at some really impressive places. I've heard Veritas and Press, all sorts of things. So thanks for taking a moment to come say hi to us.
Thanks for having me. No, it's really an honor.
Yeah. So I wanted to start off with one thing that stood out from the book for me. What is it about AC/DC that goes with Hunter Valley? Like, I thought that was such a strange, like, just tidbit that you put in there. Yeah.
Well, okay, so what you're referring to is when I mentioned doing wine and music pairings back at my early career.
Yeah.
So I had this, I think, foolish idea for a little while that I was going to play in rock bands, my whole life as I was doing in my 20s. When I was running this wine store, I ended up hiring a fair number of musicians just because it's your social network, right? And so we would do these pretty fun pairings. And it really had nothing more serious than the fact that, AC/DC is from Australia, as is Hunter Valley Semillon, and
I didn't
they
even think
both
about that.
rock pretty hard.
Okay. Okay. I can get behind that.
Really just about as deep as that.
Cool. So yeah, I think that's a great introduction to this book. So Wine Confident, I think, is a great book for someone who's just starting out. As you put it, wine, for better or worse, seems to have kind of a pretentious air about it. And I don't think it
Mhm.
needs to have all this baggage. So I think, Wine Confident was a great title for that. There's just so much extra nonsense and rules and all these regulations. I think, adding in a little, like, have a little fun, play AC/DC and Hunter Valley. There's all these different ways to enjoy wine. There's not just one way. Does that ring true to you, or?
I think, I came to wine as an adult, right? It wasn't something I was raised with. And I think a lot of Americans are what I would call first gen wine lovers, right? We weren't necessarily raised with it. I mean, some people were, but the most of the people I meet in the wine industry were not. So it's a passion driven industry for a lot of us, right? Like not a legacy driven industry. And I think because of that, and I'm guilty of this too, we tend to throw ourselves enthusiastically into the deep end of, the tradition and the history and the romance and the language and all that stuff, right? And then it's hard to sort of successfully edit that back when you're talking to somebody that's earlier in their journey. And so I think that's why sometimes there's such a mismatch. And the great blessing in my life is that I, not only don't come from a wine drinking family, but come from like a pretty straight shooting, like lower middle class family,
Mhm.
where if I start getting all fancy, and puffed up about wine, the response is like, "Whoa, look at, whoa, look at Kelly." You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I am surrounded by people
Oh
very
yeah.
happy to take me down a peg at any moment. And so I have this like voice in my head and I can hear it when I start. That's my family and the people I grew up with, that when I start to get overly floral or overly excited or in the weeds, I hear this kind of like take it down a notch, Kelly voice in the back of my head. And so I just think that I have a little bit of an anchor. And so I catch myself and then I'm sensitive to it when my friends and colleagues, even though they're not fundamentally pretentious or, people go there because it's so easy to go there in wine because it's such a complex, mysterious, historic beverage.
No, and I I'm the son of two Southern Baptist lower middle class, so I get it too. Not only are they not pretentious, they don't drink. It's a lot of like, what do you mean Châteauneuf-du-Pape?
Yeah.
You
That's a
know,
holy wine.
I sure, yeah. I think it's not only the pretentious element though, because I want to dig into that a little. I do think that a little bit of the current landscape and kind of the confusion for the end consumer is also the complexity. And so the people that do study it, there's so much information that to distill it down to people who don't know about it, it's almost easier to give some hard and fast rules. And so the end consumer is getting those, and all of a sudden you've got these yes or no. And I get it. When I started learning about wine, I was the same way. I was always looking for, like, is it X or Y? And you could always tell the people that knew a lot, because it's like, well, it can be X or Y, but there's also Z. Like, I
Yeah.
feel like you embody a lot of that. It's not either or, but kind of both, and make your own decision. If that
Well, I
makes
think, yeah,
sense.
there is this tension in approaching this book of, okay, I want to simplify these concepts, but I think that wine is very complex on every level, on the, the sort of the cultural weight of it, but also just the simple ways of tasting and consuming it and expressing that, right? So there's no easy out at kind of any point. And I think that depending on your personality, that's either really frustrating or really fascinating, right? So I wanted to kind of slow it down, strip it down, for people that were earlier in their journey. But where I have found with, and I run the risk of criticizing some of my colleagues, where I found that sometimes the like super simplified wine speak fails is that it's just like, here's a wine fact, here's a wine thing, do this thing, don't do this thing. But if you don't supply any context for that, even a little bit, even just like one paragraph of context, I think the consumer can sometimes bristle and say, like, well, now I just feel like I need to memorize these rules, and that doesn't appeal to me. Or I don't, it doesn't take much, I think, to bring out an anti-authoritarian like feeling in a lot of
Mm,
people. And I
yeah.
think sometimes that's part of the rebellion against wine, is it feels like I don't understand these rules. I don't get it. I'm too afraid of doing things wrong. And so, in the book, for example, I'll talk about things like food pairings and glassware selection. And, I'll just try to give some context, because the thing that blew my mind when I was studying wine was when I really dug into, it was actually a piece I wrote for GuildSomm on the history of the wine glass. The fact that this like modern, clear, crystal, unadorned wine glass really only goes as far back as the 1950s. And there's this wonderful Emile Peynaud quote that I'm going to get it wrong, but it's something like, does this mean that people that drank wine before the 1950s didn't enjoy it as much as we do because they didn't have the right tools? Like, that, you can't really, you can't make that assumption. And so that was very interesting to me. And it was this light bulb moment of like, okay, we have all of this anxiety and all of this economic consumer focus on buying and purchasing and serving in the right wine glasses. But this idea of the right wine glass is an incredibly contemporary notion.
Mhm.
And it's fluid over time. So just putting in that little drop of context, I think kind of relaxes the shoulders a little bit. And you're like, okay, like this is, this thing that feels like if I get it wrong is somehow going to reflect badly on my character, on my level of education or sophistication, is a little bit, is not a set in stone, right? It's not part of the 10 Commandments. So
Yeah.
I can be a little more flexible here, relax on this particular point. I found that very helpful, and I just assumed if I found it helpful, somebody else would too.
If you're enjoying this so far, please take a moment, hit like, subscribe, leave a comment, or share with a friend that you know would get value from this as well. All right, back to the podcast. If you're drinking at home or if you're working in a restaurant, you're not doing brain surgery. You're not going to kill someone. One wrong choice isn't going to ruin someone's life. And wine glasses is such a good one. And it was one of my favorite introductions to chapters you did, where you mentioned that, it would be completely out of place in America to get served wine in water glasses. But if you go to Italy, the trattorias, like, that's what they're doing there. And like, who wouldn't want to be in Italy drinking wine right now? Like, it's just a different
Right.
context for it.
Exactly. And it all just comes down to kind of, I would say, knowing or at least sensing when to pay attention to when the rules are going to serve you and when they're just there to kind of confuse you and complicate an already complicated situation.
Okay, so imagine that I am one of the listeners to this show, and I've not yet read your book. I think, can we start with smell? So just kind of give me some of the big overarching arching themes, that things I should be looking for when I pick up a glass of wine and put my nose in for the first time?
Well, so I mean,
Yes. Just break down the entirety of your career into 5 seconds, if you don't mind.
yeah,
Yes.
sure. No, I always feel bad when people ask me seemingly sounding questions and then I talk for about 45 hours. But I would say the first thing to understand about scent is that it's really paramount to the appreciation of wine. The exact percentage varies, but the scientific studies that I've tapped into recently say that scent can attribute to anywhere between 75 and 90% of flavor. And we think about flavor as sort of being localized to the mouth, probably for evolutionary reasons, right? We ingest something that's off. We want to be able to instinctively spit it out before we damage ourselves. And so it's all kind of tied into the mouth and the muscles and the chewing and the swallowing apparatus, right? But probably, the most of the flavor comes from the nose, and that gets synthesized with taste in the brain to create flavor. But the aromatics are driving that experience, right? And so for me, I found my favorite thing about wine is the smell. And I would even say that working in New York City as a sommelier, I feel like a lot of sommeliers felt that way too. And then I moved to wine country, and suddenly everybody's talking about texture. And I don't think I'm as sensitive to texture and taste as I am to smell. So I would say, first of all, smelling wine is fundamental to its flavor, right? There's other stuff too. But also, I would say that one thing that I think the wine industry really gets wrong is this overemphasis on picking out individual smells from a glass of wine. Because while that can be really fun to do, a lot of people can't do it, and it can be really alienating and off putting. And then I've talked to a lot of people that feel like that's the only way to enjoy and appreciate wine. And if you're not able to do that, you quote, don't get it. And they're like, well, I guess wine's just, not for me, or I don't have as sensitive a palate as X, Y, Z person. And the reality is that wine is probably the most aromatically complex comestible, right? And so it's really hard to do that thing that all like so many wine writers and sommeliers just seem to just do endlessly. It's really hard to do it biologically. And so I think it's not essential to the appreciation of wine. You can enjoy the complex aroma without feeling like you need to then write a list of all the individual things you get in it. So that's very important to me to communicate. And I hope that comes through.
For sure. No, and that's a good point too, because even in those of us who can go through and sometimes pick out individual items, it's a skill that falls apart relatively quickly, especially when there's pressure. Like anytime I've done tastings in front of people, a little bit of pressure, and all of a sudden your brain's blank, and it's like, I know I'm smelling red wine, but what am I smelling? And like,
Right.
it's everyone's worst nightmare when someone's like, "What do you get in that?" I don't know.
Well,
Yeah.
and there are these studies that that even wine professionals, if you give them a wine in a opaque black glass, right? So they don't know if you're drinking red or white, and the
Hmm.
wine's at like a neutral temperature, that you have a hard time accurately describing the nose or figuring out if it's red or white, because one of the things that we do neurologically or psychologically is when we see that we are drinking a red wine and we're smelling it, our brain is already editing out smells that would be more aligned with white wine, like
Hmm.
descriptors, right? You're already saying like, no, there's no peaches here because this is a red wine. So I'm going to smell red wine things. And you're going to look for those things. So we have these skills that we're honing, but like the psychology of it is also in there too. So that's why I think it's just a good idea not to get hung up on that
Sure.
stuff,
I mean,
even though it can be
that
fun.
that is the whole reason they do blind tasting and certifications and wine evaluation too. You pull so much of the label and your concepts in that you don't know what is in your head versus what's in the glass.
Exactly. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. I think it's funny, before 2020, I think the whole journey of convincing people that the things that they're tasting are primarily tied to aromatics was a little more difficult. But after everyone got a taste of COVID and like a huge swath of the population lost their smell for a while, more people are on that camp. It's like, remember what happened when you were sick? Yeah.
Food taste.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was terrifying. It happened to me, and I was like, "Well, shit. This
I know.
this is
Yeah.
all this better come back because I don't, I can barely type."
I lost mine and I thought I got my smell back. And like, it was when I was still actively buying. And for about 6 months after, I swear, like everything that people brought me to taste, I was just like, I did not add anything on. Then I still remember there was a guy that works for it's a premium distributors in Oklahoma. He brought me a taste of different like possible by the glass stuff, crazy, like $7 to $13 retail range. Like it was all pretty
Mhm.
basic. I remember the whole time I was smelling, I was like, these are freaking amazing. And like I remember telling him like I'm going to get this cohort, like I'm going for this. And a couple weeks later, I was like, I think I just got my smell back. I think I just never fully got it back, and now like now everything seems amazing. But you like you go from 0 to like 70%, and it's like okay, I've got my smell back. But it I think it did linger for me, and I've heard that with other people. They just like some people never fully got it back too, which is
It's scary.
terrifying. Yeah,
And the other thing I think that was a very interesting experience to go through was being pregnant, and your
interesting.
senses also change and your preferences change. There were certain foods that I couldn't eat, and some of which I still struggle with, and I haven't been pregnant for almost 5 years now. So that was an interesting experience to go through in terms of understanding preference and how much of that might be kind of hardwired to our body chemistry.
Yeah. I think that's a great segue. I think one of your more powerful kind of suggestions for the reader, quality versus preference, and like really understanding that difference. And that's something that I've often struggled in parting to usually servers. Like I hear a lot like, when I'm asking in pre-shift lineups, like, what do you recommend for Sauvignon? I don't really like Sauvignon Blanc. It's like, yes, but that's not the question, is it? Yeah. But yeah, well, how do you square that circle?
Yeah, well, I think that for a lot of consumers that are just starting out, the goal, the game is to figure out like, what do you like? Because there's a lot of options out there. And, one of the things that I think I was just sort of realizing in the book, but I've come to really believe, and so I don't remember how much I emphasized in the book, but I believe now that people tend to kind of organize their preference more according to taste and texture than to aromatics, right? Like people will say, I want a drier wine, or I don't want anything too tannic, or I don't want anything too sharp, or I really like bright, zesty wines. Like people are organizing by taste and texture,
Light high
by like, I
acid.
don't,
Yeah, that's how I drink. Yeah.
right. They're not like, I don't want anything that smells like apricots. Like, you know what I mean? Like that's not a, that's a, such, the aromatic thing is not it really. I don't think fundamental when it comes to preference, but finding your preference is really important. But that's step one. And I remember I had this anxiety because I've never really been great at, let's say, holding my liquor. So I'm
Sure.
always been more of a wine drinker. So I don't drink cocktails all that often. And because of that, it took me a really long time to find my drink. And I would go to bars and I would just feel this anxiety of like, okay, what do I like? What do I order? I need to keep trying things.
Hmm.
What's my drink? And it took me a
Can't do
long time to
vodka soda
figure out
again.
that. Yeah, exactly. Like it just took me a long time to figure out that, oh, okay, what I like are like high acid gin based drinks. Like I don't like Negronis. I don't like this other stuff I'm supposed to like. I like high acid gin. Like give me a bee's knees all day, or whatever. So, but now that I figured that out, now I can focus on quality both within and without the preference mindset. So I can now, like, when tasting gin and tonics, know the difference between a really good one and a not so good one, right? And things like that. So with wine, I think when you kind of graduate after you figure out what you like, which is great, the more your palate matures, the more you can kind of say, okay, well, my preference is maybe less important in this moment than being able to recognize relative quality within a category, even if it's not my fave. So that's, I think, more probably relevant to wine professionals, but it can be useful for consumers too.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, it is part of the whole journey of learning to love wine and interact with wine is dealing with wine when you're with others. And you are often going to find yourself in situations where not everyone's going to like low alcohol, high acid white wines like me. Like most people like reds. And so when I go over to people's houses or I'm splitting a bottle, it's like, where can we find an in between ground where we're both going to be happy? So, yeah.
Exactly. And this is obviously, anyone that's worked as a sommelier knows this, that even within a two top, a married couple that drinks together all the time, there'll be different preferences and like bridges you have to build. So yeah, absolutely.
Every
It's an
time.
important consideration.
Yeah, I'm like literally every time. One of the big things that you always mention in the book, or at least kind of point to, is the need to try a bunch of different things to expand your palate, to get that familiarity. And I was wondering if you could talk on that a little bit, because I think that's such an important thing for someone getting into wine.
Yeah, and so I mentioned this as you say in a couple different places, and so I talk about how a lot of restaurants will be very happy so long as you don't cross over to being like overly needy, to let you try multiple things by the glass, which is a great way when you're starting out to sort of figure out like basic categories of wine, because most restaurants hopefully are choosing multiple like different expressions of what wine can be, right? The whole spectrum of wine. So you can try that and get a real macro understanding. And then, with a little tasting group or even a Coravin, you can focus on a category and start to dial into the nuance of, I know I like Pinot Noir. I'm going to get a mixed case of Pinot Noirs from around the world and start to figure out, within that broader area, what I like, and learn there. But the other advice that I give is like, that's not always practical. People aren't always that geeky, or want to commit that much time and energy to it. So the advice I give for people that are just getting started is to be a little bit more organized about their exploration and not just grab a random bottle every time, because I think it's hard unless you're, actively cultivating on like building your mental like wine database and you just living your life thinking about other things and then occasionally grab a random bottle of wine. It's hard to organize it. So I would say what the advice I give is to just start with one bottle. Like find a bottle that you like enough, like more than a little. Like it doesn't have to be the best wine ever, but something that you enjoy and you would drink again if you had it. And then just take one step into the unknown. So
Mhm.
if it's like I'm sitting in the middle now. So it's a Napa Valley Cabernet. That step could be a different wine from that same producer. It could be that same wine in a different vintage. It could be a Cabernet from a different place. It could be, or it could be a different grape from Napa Valley. So
Mhm.
and then you like that better or you like that worse. If you like that better, that's your new jumping off point. You pick a new data point and you just follow that back. And if you liked it less, then you go back to the former wine and you pick a new data point. And that just I think it becomes a little bit more manageable than just bouncing around the world of wine.
Yeah. No, and I like that because, like, in our hypothetical scenario where we have, say, like Jane Doe, who's into Napa cabs and going to explore, if she's just randomly grabbing bottles, and I know this from my past before I even like got good, you're probably gonna grab like the $3 or $5 bottle at Trader Joe's, or you're gonna get the discount section at the wine store, and so you're gonna end up drinking a lot of like random Gewürztraminer, like, and then you're at home thinking, I must not like wine. Whereas, in all honesty, you would have loved wine had you gotten to cabs and then started exploring, and then maybe realized you like cab, but you also like Cab Franc from Napa. As you start, like, you just got to find one foot in, and then you can kind of claw your way into the rest of it. And then,
Exactly. You need an anchor. Otherwise, you're just like out to sea,
yeah, that's kind of how you got into it. I listened to an interview, I think it was a white Châteauneuf-du-Pape that kind of made it click for you.
which is really funny because honestly, if I was in a retail store with one of everything, that would be one of the probably last types of wine I would reach for anymore. Yeah, it was yeah, the way when I started getting into wine, because I wasn't a drinker and I didn't have like, I didn't have that like sweeter or like cheaper like wine arc,
No
chasing that
Moscato's
buzz.
days, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't have that. And so I just kind of came in and was like, "Whoa, I want to like taste the fancy stuff," which in my mind was, Bordeaux and Scotch, but I couldn't afford that. So the sort of Bordeaux like wines and Scotch like things I was consuming were really aggressive in terms of like flavor profile and just not, like I think the equivalency I gave in the book was like, that's like starting to drink coffee with a double espresso. Like you're probably going to start with like drip coffee with cream and sugar, and then you're going to slowly, if you want, not everybody does that. I still take milk in my coffee, but you're going to
Yeah.
slowly maybe walk that back. And so I just was like, oh, I don't get alcohol. It's not my thing. I don't like the flavors. And then I ended up coming across a white Rhone, and like John Kongsgaard here in Napa describes the flavors of Roussan as being like really snuggly, and he always gives himself like a little hug like this. And that I thought was always really perfect because that's what that wine felt like back then. It was just gentle and aromatically interesting, and it didn't like rip my, you know, the ceiling of my mouth. It was a hug.
Yeah.
It was nice.
Especially after drinking a bunch of really cheap Bordeaux and cheap Scotch. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
this is home. This is, yeah,
Yeah, exactly. Oh, I get it now.
yeah.
Okay. I can see why people like this.
I can't go completely away from choosing bottles of wine without mentioning your so you have a little shout out to how different people select bottles, and I thought it was funny because you start off with always order the second cheapest, then the bougie example of always order the second most expensive, which I've seen both strategies work for the people that do them. But then you had a boyfriend who had, I think, the best strategy I've ever heard. I like literally laughed out loud. Can you tell that story? Because that is, I shared
Man,
that with
I
someone right after I read that.
haven't spoken to this person in like decades. I don't even know. Well, I mean, not decades, but a decade. I don't even know if they're aware that I wrote about them. But basically, I went on a date with a young man and was, I would say, young enough and probably brainwashed enough to feel like he needed to be in the driver's seat in terms of choosing a wine. I would never do that now. But back then, I thought like, let's not emasculate this man right out of the gate. So I let him choose a wine, and it was awesome. I don't remember what we were eating necessarily, but he picked a Macon Very Classé, from some producer, and it was like affordable but interesting and a really good value and just delicious and perfect with the food. And I just
It's like,
thought,
who
oh
is
my
this
God,
guy? Yeah.
this is a good sign. And then we went on, like another couple dates, and I let him choose the wine, and he just ended up with these totally tragic bottles. And eventually I just sort of took over. And then, months later, I was sort of asking, like telling him how initially I thought he was so good at wine, and then, he wasn't. And he said, well, but I have a system, and I was using my system to order wine. And I said, what's your system? And he said, well, I just ordered the bottle with the most accent marks.
Which, I mean, that's the thing. It's not the worst thing I've ever heard. Like, I've heard people with way different ideas, and like, for most of the restaurants I've been in, it would kind of work. You'll at
Yeah,
least get
yeah,
something you wouldn't
yeah.
have ordered.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. That's how we end up at Macon Virey Classé, which
I
is
mean, there's a
great.
lot of accents there. Yeah.
Mhm.
One thing that you mentioned that I don't think I've ever seen anyone put in print, but I do appreciate. You actually recommend that people call the store and talk to the som before service starts, and I thought that was really clever. Is
Call the
Yeah,
restaurant. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, because that happened to me and I loved it. I absolutely loved it because, you know how it is. I mean, you've worked the floor and it's like managed chaos, right? And especially, depending on how the restaurant is staffed, how many sommeliers you have, how crazy the wine list is, like you might have to commit some certain element of triage where this bottle isn't getting decanted enough, or this is, anyway, the more that you can know ahead of time what you're doing and map that out, just the better the overall experience was. And so, yeah, it was great because I started to train some of my regulars. And this was, of course, a very specific restaurant, Veritas, with a very deep wine list with a lot of old wine and a ton of sommeliers on staff. And a lot of those wines required special handling. So it was a
Mm.
different kind of a joint, right? And so it cultivated regulars because, people that like that sort of thing, there weren't a lot of places for that. So I would train people, be like, hey, next time, I know you really enjoyed this, coat roti is just hitting its stride by the time you're leaving. Next time you come in, if you think you want to drink something like this, like let me know and I will take your credit card and I will open it, 2 hours before you get here so that it can be where it needs to be. And that was awesome. And not everybody, not every place can accommodate that, but that was just such a beautiful thing. Also, I think told a story in there about a guy who wanted to impress his colleagues, his work colleagues. And so he just wanted to have a game plan going in, not so much that to choose the wines ahead of time, but to just feel comfortable with the list and to go over options
Mm.
privately before he's in the sort of public theater of this work event. And that was also fantastic.
Yeah. 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 I definitely experienced that on the floor Friday at 7 o'clock. Like, you spend what time you can, but I mean, you're moving, and like Sally over here needs me to comp something, and then like table 31's still not cleared, but we have the eight top coming. Like, and then
Oh, yeah.
that's right when everyone wants everything. But yeah, that I get it a lot for bottles of champagne on the table to be ready. Like, usually it's like husbands or wives calling for anniversaries for each other, and that's great. It's just there, it's ready and chilled. Yeah, so
That's great because that's a dream, right? Because then people have wine in their glass while they're looking at the wine list for the next bottle, and you're probably selling that extra bottle. You have a higher likelihood of selling that extra bottle if you're able to get that first bottle out to them right away. So I think this good economic policy anyway for the restaurant.
So everyone listening at home, give me a call before you come in. I did want to talk a little bit about pairing because we've kind of talked about it tangentially, but I want to really dig
What?
pairing.
Oh yeah, sure.
Pairing. Yeah, sorry.
It's okay.
I may have cut out or something.
So you said herring. No, I heard
Oh,
something else.
herring. Yeah. I mean, my wife's Russian, so I might have said herring. You never know. You kind of break it down, and if I remember correctly, you have 4 steps. Basically, like, pick which is going to shine, the wine or the food. Pick your strategy. Like, I like the way that you kind of simplified it. It's like, don't overthink it. Pick the star, pick what method, and then just kind of go for it. Essentially, is how I
Yeah.
remember it. So, yeah. What are the
Well, I
things
think
that people get wrong?
Well, I think if anybody's looking for like a really detailed, this is one of the parts of the book where I had to really think about what I wanted to say because I know that the publisher reached out to me because they specifically wanted a sommelier's perspective. And I know that for a lot of people's conception of a sommelier is as somebody that specializes in pairings above all other things. And this is where I think I depart from a lot of my colleagues. So first of all, I want to say if anybody's looking for really great, like detailed pairing advice. The best I've seen written down is the Jordan McKay, Raj Parb book, Secret of the Sommeliers. Like that has really good, very specific advice. I decided that wouldn't really be true to me because food and wine pairing is something where I think it's important, but I also think it is one of those places where consumers especially get like choked with anxiety of like I'm going to do this wrong, I'm going to ruin everything. And my sort of feeling is like there is such beautiful upside to a great food and wine pairing and there's almost no downside. Like there's no risk, nobody's going to ruin anything by pairing the wine wrong. So I didn't want to like over go here, but you're right. So the basic advice that I gave, which I think I haven't read the section in a while, was like somebody's got to lead the dance, right?
Hmm.
If it's a super complex wine, maybe a simple meal so that it's not upstaging the wine. Vice versa, if you're putting all of your energy into creating like this masterpiece in the kitchen, like a well made but supportive, like a supporting actor wine is the move rather than having like two really
Yeah.
complex like things like here that can work, but I find it's usually better to pick one. And then there are some basics to food and wine pairing, but I would say again, worry less about aromatics and worry more about taste and texture, acidity, level of tannin, alcoholic weight, like the heaviness of the wine or the lightness of the wine. These are more important pairing considerations than what the bouquet is like, right? So let the sort of texture and taste drive from the pairing. And then I would say you want to also match flavor intensity feels really important. So like for example, one of the I think good, but also pretty lazy, like classic pairing suggestion is like anytime you have anything like spicy, like especially if it's like non-Western spicy, and you want to put sweet Riesling with it, like that's fine, that's great. The sweetness does help, like with the piquancy, but if you have like a really powerful, flavorful dish and just a weakly flavored, but like somewhat like off dry Riesling, like that's gonna get knocked out. Like you need to have matching flavor intensity as well. And then I think what else I mentioned, maybe just some consideration into like the actual preparation of the main protein as like a guide, whether something's
Yeah.
like roasted or poached, or that will come into effect as well. And then ultimately, I know that I said like, but also this is a place where you can get really creative and have a lot of fun.
Hmm.
So and I think, like I said, if you accept what I say, that there's all upside and no downside to food and wine pairing, then it's kind of like a nice license to get creative and funky with things.
Yeah, and if you try something and it's not perfect, at the end of the day, you did still have a nice bite of food and a glass of wine, probably. It's like
Right.
there are very, very few instances that you can truly mess it up. Like Napa cab with oysters is probably not going to be ideal. Like there's some that you could like really make things that no one would probably ever want to put together and say, okay, that probably is not going to be great. But 9 times out of 10, it doesn't, like if you do a Pinot Noir versus a Grenache versus like it's probably going to be pretty good. If you got a pork chop, you're probably going to be fine. Yeah.
Well, one thing that's funny is when my husband and I first moved here from New York and we were starting the wine program at Press, which at the time was a steakhouse. So, lots of steaks and also lots of oysters, lots of seafood towers, right? That restaurant was an all Napa wine list. Needless to say, we sold mostly Cabernet. And he used to have his hair on fire running around the dining room. He even at some point abandoned trying to sell people white wine for their oysters and just would like splash them like just with anything kind of crispy and white around the oysters. I mean, he'd like wear holes in the carpet, just running around like a madman trying to, make that nice. And then eventually I was like, no one cares. Like, that's fine. Like, they're
Yeah,
very
yeah.
happy to have their Cabernet with their oysters. Like, who are we to,
This
jump in and be like, oh my God,
I
you're
guess
screwing this up. What are you
just
doing?
yeah, just because I wouldn't doesn't mean someone wouldn't. And it's true. I mean, I've got a seafood tower with oysters at my place, and I'm sure like if I start looking at it, I'm sure I will see people drinking red wine with them. I Yeah. Yeah. So it goes. Are there one thing I wanted to ask you, were there any sections in the book that you really like almost made it in but made the cut, just didn't quite fit in? Any sections that you were like, I really had this planned, but it just didn't work out?
I battled with the publisher a little bit on some of the charts at the end. Like I think there's like a relative tannin level chart or something that was they very much wanted to include, and I was sort of like on the fence about it, and it got included, and I would say I still look at that and I'm like, I'm not sure I'm like 100% on this chart, but okay. I thought about a lot about including like basic um and they wanted to also include like basic grape information, which again I was sort of like so I
Who are
we
you,
we
wine
worked on.
folly? Come on. No.
Well, no, I was just like, okay, like I can see why you want this, but there were other things that I thought about including and ultimately didn't, like guides to regions and things like that. But we ended up, just broad strokes, but we ended up taking that out because the things that I wanted to communicate more, which felt more important to me, although maybe not to the consumer, were things like talking about farming.
Yeah.
And like there's not a lot of intro to wine books, I don't think, that go into the same viticultural detail that I did. And again, that might be because nobody cares and they know that, and so why would they include that? But for me, one of the great awakenings of specifically moving to wine country, but just sort of wine in general, is wine is this amazing differentiator in that, unlike a lot of the other alcoholic options, like it feels the most like grown. And I think especially in an era of climate change and, kind of whatever is going on with like the EPA, like public lands and our like national relationship to the planet. I think that is really grounding and kind of fundamental to wine for me. I think we can't, like, we spend a lot of time in wine media, I think, talking about like vintage variation without talking about climate and farming. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like you kind of need to have both. And I think it serves the consumer to remind them that this is an agricultural product, not like something that is assembled in a factory. I mean, obviously some wines are, but fine wine, let's say, is grown. It's subject to the whims of Mother Nature, both in terms of like the volume that might be available in a given vintage and the character of that year. And also the hands that touch a bottle of wine are really important. And the intention behind the farming is fundamental to this concept of terroir, which, hopefully anybody that's reading a wine book, it buys into it, at least on some level, right? So I was very passionate about including stuff on that for all these like kind of moral reasons. And then the last chapter of the book was an idea for a totally separate book that I had years ago and just never kind of got the rubber to the road. And it maybe I could see, nobody's like said this, but I could see how it almost doesn't belong to the rest of the book. It's like its own thing that's sort of glued on to the end, but it was
That's where
super
it's like,
important.
this is what wine did for me kind of thing. Is that part or?
Yeah, like
Yeah.
wine as a vehicle for social and economic and professional advancement.
Yeah.
Because I think like I am maybe overly practical in my life. And I think like part of what has been good for me about wine is like the whimsy of it all and the romance. I think it's just like good for my soul to have this levity. The thing that I thought is always kind of weird about wine is we talk about wine to people and collectors and lovers and beginners as if the only thing that matters is like the aesthetic realm of wine, the aesthetic experience of wine. Like, oh my God, it's going to taste like this. And this is a rare wine, and this is a fine wine, and this is, craftsmanship and 100 points. Or we talk about all this like aesthetic kind of lofty stuff. But I also think that that's great. And maybe that's the only reason why wine education is worthwhile. But I wanted to make like a more practical case for learning about wine, in that like, okay, that's great and that's totally legit. And you can chase that, white whale of perfect aesthetic moments. That's totally, that's a good North Star. But also, a working knowledge of wine can help you network with people that might advance your career, might provide you with some differentiation in like a crowded job market, right? That might help you navigate the corporate ladder, might help you overcome a socioeconomic or demographic disadvantage, right? Like that might help you form lifelong relationships and friendships. It might help you overcome hardships or repair broken relationships, right? That might, all these things. And so what I did with the last chapter was, which is called Take the List, is like it's basically a call to action of like, okay, this is like still, I would imagine, like most people going out to dinner, even the most well-meaning sommelier, if you probably averaged the experience, I would still bet that the majority of wine lists are being handed to like older white males,
Hmm.
at the table, right? And so there's this
Even the ones that don't
opportunity
want
for
it.
every
Yeah. Yeah.
right, exactly. And there's an opportunity for everybody else to like seize that and be like, no, there's power in choosing a wine, right? There is a little bit of it's like anything else. It's like social dynamics, come into play when you are negotiating or something like that, right? Like all of these moments are important. And so I think there's an opportunity. There's power in wine knowledge. There's power in sort of taking control of the dining experience, especially in a professional setting, in a way that not just is like, I'm making this decision and this is the best wine and I chose it, but in a way that can be really inclusive and sort of signal other aspects of your personality. And so I interviewed all these different people and was basically like, okay, beyond the aesthetics, beyond like, yum, this wine tastes good, what has a wine knowledge done for your life? And I got all of these really interesting stories of people, attracting the attention of somebody in the C-suite because they selected an excellent bottle of wine. I spoke to one woman that I loved talking to, where she knows a ton about wine, but she specifically asks clients she is considering working with to choose the wine because she wants to see how they do it. She wants to see, do they poll anybody else at the table to see what they're interested in, or are they just trying to like alpha male the situation? How are they treating the wait staff? Like what's
Yeah.
their tone? Like, and for her, she is reading those tea leaves and figuring out like, do I want to work with this person or not, without be outside of a professional, context of just like, is this a good human? Do I like the way they're handling this moment. So I thought all of that was really, really interesting. Again, a little bit odd to probably include in an intro to wine book, but a point of passion for me.
Yeah, better living through alcohol is the idea. I mean, I'm the poster child for knowing a little bit about wine and it doing something for your life. I had to move unexpectedly and I ended up in a new city very quickly, and I had certified somm and that was it. But I walked into a restaurant, had a job that week we moved. It's wild. It does change things. Going back to what you were talking about, how you described in detail actually growing the wine, I think that's so powerful for a book about, people beginning. Because what I've always done, I teach just beginner wine classes to a lot of the like people that are joining our serving team that may not have a lot of experience. And the big thing I always try to get people that are new, get them to a good enough spot that they can read like a text sheet without having any fear. I feel like the way you were going through it, like describing the oak, describing, malolactic, like just going through a bunch of these words that you just take for granted when you're in the wine world, they're like super useful. And then I was
Yeah.
hoping I could end one of my favorite things you said, you snuck it in, is fine wine can't just be made, it must be grown. And I feel like that is throughout the book, but that was just a beautiful line. And I think that's something that stuck with me. I think it will.
Well, I want to thank you for reading the book so carefully. I'm very touched because I've definitely done podcasts with people that have not read it at
What do you
all.
mean wine? Yeah. No. Well, yeah, no, I mean, I've been reading your writing for a while, so I couldn't
Thank
come
you.
empty-handed. Yeah. For the person who's listening who may not know your work, where should someone go to find out more about you or follow you and see what you do?
Well, I mean, it's tough to say. I would say probably the best way to read my work, all the old stuff I wrote on GuildSomm years ago is not behind a paywall, so it's all free to the public. You don't even need a membership to read it. So I hope that stuff is evergreen and still interesting. I've got obviously the two books, Napa Valley Then and Now and Wine Confident, which you can buy. Currently, I offer wine classes to guests of Meadowood and members of the Napa Valley Reserve. So maybe not accessible to all, but that's where some people can find me. And then beyond that, I'm a very disappointing Instagram follow. I've become a little bit more of a mommy blogger than providing any kind of meaningful wine content. And I have taken all of the other socials out of my life. I don't really, I guess just listen to this podcast over and over would be probably the best thing
Yes,
to
yes.
do.
Do a couple Google searches. There's some other podcasts you can listen to too. Well, that's awesome. Thank you. I know you've got things that you got to do, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. It was a real pleasure to get to meet you and talk about this. So, thank you.
Thank you. So happy to have chatted. I appreciate it.
Thank you again for listening. If you have not, please like, subscribe, and also leave a comment on this show. Every interaction is really, really appreciated. I respond personally to every message, comment I get. Episodes of this show come out every Tuesday, every week. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out, and I'm looking forward to talking to you again soon. Thank you.